Welcome to the Skeptical Auditor podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Hernan Murdock. Today we continue our conversation with Kathleen Crawford, a trainer, consultant, content developer, and communications expert. In this episode, we talk about cross-cultural communications and ways to improve our ability to learn new things in our rapidly changing world. She also shares new experiences working on two projects and what made one of them particularly successful, while the other was not so. All that and more, starting now. Kathleen, so when we're talking about different skills and practices, because sometimes we think of these things, there's a definition, right, for skills and competencies and practices and so on. But when we bring all of these things together, what are some of the things that internal auditors should practice more often and really should keep in line and in mind as they go about doing their work? What are some of the things that they should be focusing on?
One thing that occurs to me is that we need to be more mindful of what some people have labeled cross-cultural communication. So we've spoken about communication a little bit already, but I think it's important to realize that there are multiple generations in the workplace. For example, I am a woman of a certain age, and sometimes the people that I interact with are significantly younger than I am. I also work with some people who are older than I am. And we tend to express ourselves, or we may express ourselves differently. So I think it's important to be attentive to how people express themselves and to try to um, maybe not match entirely, because I'm certainly not going to use some of the slang that younger people use, except sometimes when I'm around my nieces and nephews, now my great nieces and nephews. Um, but it is something that I have observed in a personal sense. Um, I come from a large family, and as my nieces and nephews were growing up, they sat at a kids' table at Thanksgiving, and the adults sat at an adults' table at Thanksgiving. Don't worry, this does have a professional application in a second. But I noticed that when they were, sort of in their own tribe, they talked very differently, and they had a certain looseness and a certain shorthand that was it was easy to observe, but it was hard to understand. But then if they, say, approached my mother, their grandmother, they spoke to her very differently, more formally, more slowly sometimes, things like that. And so what I'm getting at is age and life experience, and maybe even regions of the country or the world that you live in, as we start to meet up with each other and work together, auditor and client, and auditor to auditor. I think it really is important to be um, mindful and accepting of, and curious about how people express themselves and how we work together to get things done. Um,
So there are a couple of things that I'm hearing from what you're describing, and one of them is how we go beyond the traditional definition of cross-cultural, which is kind of
mhm.
national origin, and
Right.
of course can think in terms of religion and so on, but you're also thinking in terms of gender and age as also
Hmm.
elements of different cultures, right? Your cohort in some cases and so on. So that is one dimension, right? Be very attuned to all of those things. The other thing that I am hearing is the importance of being aware of these dynamics, because not all of it is now happening face to face. And when I say face to face, by being physically in the same geographic location, right? We're now working from home. People are using video conferencing, whether it's GoToMeeting, or whether it's Zoom, or whether it's Team, or whatever platform you're using. But video conferencing is a tool that has been used as a result of the pandemic. But going forward, chances are we're going to use it continuously going forward. So that being the case, as a manager, as a leader, as a teammate, as someone who cares about your colleagues, I think it's very important that we look out for each other and we help coach each other so that we are able to navigate this new world because of that, let's call it different. environment in which we are now going to work. So this is a
Right.
very important point you're bringing to our attention here.
Right. I also I think part of it too is to be willing um, willing um, to listen. It goes back to listening, doesn't it? Really willing to listen, not to the words, but to the context underneath the words. That can be challenging sometimes when someone else has a different sort of accent or a different rhythm to speech. And I think it's important to be alert to that and really tune into that and listen hard and not be afraid. This is my opinion, and I'd be happy to discuss this with you. um, not be afraid to ask people to repeat themselves or to clarify what they're saying, because if you finesse the listening, you miss so much. And I mean finesse in the negative sense, like you're trying to blow by what somebody says and hope that you'll figure it out as they get to the next sentence and the next sentence. And meanwhile, you've lost what they've just said.
Right. Very good point. I think that that is an important thing to do. And there's a way to do it, right? Sometimes people
Mhm.
feel that it will be rude to ask them to repeat or so. My experience has been that it's number one, risky, like you just highlighted, but
Mhm.
also it is a matter of how you ask. And you can
Right.
ask in a very respectful and polite way, or you can be rude when you do. And that is really where the problem may surface from. So I agree with you. I think that that is an important thing to do because you may miss so much. And once again, going back to this environment where we are working with video conferencing, body
Mhm.
language is only limited. So from that perspective, then we're also to some extent missing on part of that communication. One of the things that I would like to highlight, I mean not highlight, but I would like your input on, is the ability to learn. So we've been
Mhm.
talking a bit about skills and competencies and so on, but it appears to me that one of the success elements for the future is going to be the ability to learn new things and learn it in new ways, because
Mhm.
historically a lot of what we learned was in a classroom, a traditional classroom with rows and right, and there has an instructor at the front and we'll talk and we'll do our thing. Then of course we went from that very structure to maybe having those pods and those breakout groups, which is more interactive, but even then it's a lot on site. We're seeing
Right.
now a lot of the learning taking place video happening, learning on your own. I'm paying attention a lot to people talking about, you just google it, there's probably a YouTube video out there somewhere and they'll show you how to do something, right? So it's again, the way people learn is different. So what is your take about that ability to learn?
I am insatiably curious. So you will never have to convince me uh, to go out and Google it, or to ask somebody how to solve a particular problem. Or um, I notice you're doing this way. Why do you do it that way? I am insatiably curious, and I do believe that it's important to evolve or to stay current on things.
Mhm.
I would do it anyway. It certainly helps me in a professional context to be that curious and to be that committed to learning new things. But I probably would have done it anyway. And I think it goes back to what I said about, going through to many different schools and meeting many different kinds of people. Um, I, I well, I don't know what else to say except I believe in it. I believe it's important. No, seriously,
Right.
because the people who invest in others as well as themselves are the ones who are going to be the leaders of the next generation. Being willing to experiment and to adapt is so vital.
And the fact that the world is changing, not only
Hmm.
to the extent that it is changing, right? There's a lot of change happening, but it is very deep as well, very substantial change happening as well. And in my experience, over the last few years, observing some auditors who are in some cases getting very uncomfortable with traditional versus agile, Or
Hmm.
I'm a business auditor now. I need to learn IT or cybersecurity. Or again, we can continue to talk about different
Right.
ways and different types of change that they are subject to, and or organizations that are buying and selling divisions and merging and various things like those. So all of these dynamics definitely bring to the surface this topic around ability to learn, adaptability, flexibility, and the need for people to be able to function in that new world that we are now living in.
Yeah, as you were talking, that's the word that hit me was adaptability. I don't want to say adapt or die, but adapt or be left behind, because unless we adapt, we're not going to make the progress that we hope to, whether that's as an individual contributor or as a team, as a nation. You can take that telescope and kind of pull it out and look at the world. And if the world does not adapt, we're not going to survive, or at least not survive in the way that we would like to. That was a little
We'll be
heavy.
right
Didn't
back.
mean it to be.
I understand. We'll be right back.
This episode is brought to you by ACI Learning. Are you looking for CPE credits, professional development, to continue your education, or a custom team training solution? Here at ACI Learning, we've been building high-quality training for over 40 years, meeting the needs of every learner. Our training solutions will keep you and your team engaged and motivated to learn, helping students stay sharp in their field and better serve the organization. Join thousands of global audit, risk, and compliance professionals. Visit acilearning.com to find out how we're disrupting the audit learning space.
Kathleen, when you think about the many projects you have worked on over the years, is there one that you will label as the best project ever?
Yes. You want to know
Okay,
more?
what does it like? Yes, please tell us
um,
about that.
so I was working for a social service agency here in Massachusetts, and over time they had taken on a lot of money management responsibility for people who they served that were unable to manage their money themselves. So they're a representative payee for quite a few individuals, and that role had grown quite a lot, and it was being done a lot of different ways because this is a geographically dispersed agency. So the best project I worked on was after I left the agency and they hired me back as a consultant to help them get their arms around this particular issue. They were having some difficulty with proper reconciliation and adherence to all the rules and things like that. So the reason that I loved this particular project is that it allowed me to to interact with all sorts of people in all different parts of the agency, and problem solve and brainstorm about how to get it right, how to streamline things, how to make things consistent. Um, and many of the things that we have spoken about before, the problem solving, the collaboration, the clear communication, all came together. It took a long time, but the ride was fun. The people were great. We solved problems, and they had some real um, positive consequences in terms of not having to pay back money that they had not, accounted for properly. They got really creative and good about doing things in a more consistent fashion. It was one of the best things one of the best things ever. And then we also collaborated on the training program so that we could teach other people in the agency how to do it. And that was another part of it that was also a huge amount of fun. So, had a lot of fun, did a lot of good, and it's something I'm really, really proud of. And I'm really proud of the people who participated and made it happen.
Sounds like a very productive engagement in that it was not the traditional audit in the sense of going to find out what's broken and how you can write them up,
Yeah.
but starting from the point of there are issues, they know there are issues. Let's document those, but more importantly, let's work together to find ways of fixing them
Mm-hmm.
sustainably. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that this sounds like a very productive engagement at so many levels. Now, let's turn that around a little bit. And how about let's label it the worst project ever, if there's such a thing?
It may not be the worst ever, but the one that is most memorable is an assignment that I was given by our same agency, but while I was employed by them, not as an outside consultant. Um, our The CEO at the time was someone who was very, very active in the disability space all around the country, and he came back from um, a conference of some sort and asked me to look into how we were using how were we using or misusing our payroll practices. So, just to give people a little context, in order to be able to staff a lot of programs 24/7, you have a cadre of people who work full time, you have a cadre of people who work part time, and then you have another class of employee that are on call, basically. And in order to manage the payroll dollars, if there is, say, someone who calls out sick, the protocol was to call somebody up who was one of those on call people. And so, what he was interested in was whether or not we were being efficient and specifically committed to those protocols, and what kinds of, were we using our money the way that other agencies use our money, and were we making it stretch as best we could? Because payroll, as you might expect in an agency like that, is the biggest expense. So, very, very
Yeah.
detailed analysis. Went through the whole thing. Learned that they weren't they weren't always following the protocols, and I say they in the broadest possible sense. And so the recommendation was commit to your protocols. These are the procedures that you have. This is what should be happening. And so if you and I also analyzed financially how much money would have been saved had they committed
Okay.
to that.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
presented it to him. He liked it, but he wanted his senior VPs to sign off on it, and they said no. So a lot of work was done for
Oh.
for to no effect at all. And sadly, or rather, I thought it was going to be sadly, um, he asked me to do the same thing about 2 years later, and I'm like, why?
What was the point? Yeah.
The same two people are your senior vice presidents. They're going to say we don't care. Um, but the difference between the first and the second was um, the uh, the major hospitals in our region had recently changed their practices in terms of how many extra hours of overtime they would permit their resident doctors and their what's the other, not resident, but there are two categories of medical students.
Interns?
Interns, thank you. um, and having that sort of as something that was sort of off to the side but relevant to the analysis, we we started looking at whether or not um, excessive overtime had some unintended consequences in terms of health and safety. And we didn't have to look very far to find some incident reports that were definitely related to people working longer hours than they probably physically could or should. So the second
Wow.
one had a little bit of a different dimension. The first one was definitely the worst project ever.
Yeah.
And the second
Oh,
one was
wow.
more successful.
Well, one of the things about these experiences, right, is what you learn from them, number one.
Yeah.
But as I'm listening to this, and of course, different time, different place, and different resources, but as I'm hearing the dynamics and what perhaps created the problem. It sounds like some of the technologies that we're talking about now a lot about, like RPA, robotic process automation, and so on, where automation may have precluded the ability to charge to the wrong account, to
Right.
solicit the wrong person,
Right.
reconciliation that were not done could have been flagged sooner or differently. So all of those dynamics could have probably been helped by some technology there. But again, looking for how we can extract some lessons out of all of those incidents. And of course, compliance is a very tricky and delicate matter. So let's talk a little bit about those individuals who may be new to the profession of internal auditing, and what kind of advice would you give them?
My advice would be to take every opportunity to learn that you can. We talked about lifelong learning, and my insatiable curiosity. I would also say that talk to people, be friendly. Um, there's still pockets of people who don't understand what internal audit is. And if you understand what it is, then try to educate others as to what it is. Try to also let them know what you have in mind to accomplish, but solicit their input. I would say I would give that same advice to anyone at whatever level when they go into a new organization, whether they're internal auditor or something else, because I think that's how you build rapport with people. That's how you build connection and bridges with others, so that you can collaborate as opposed to um, doing audit to them. It's auditing with them. I think that my best advice would be to be curious as well as to present yourself as someone who is collaborative and curious and interested in learning how things work and how they might help um, solve problems and make things better.
Great advice. I really think that this will be definitely very well received by those who are new to the profession. Like you said, those who are also in the profession, how they can continue to grow, develop, and be successful. So thank you very much, Kathleen. I really enjoyed speaking with you, and great words of wisdom that I extracted from it. And I'm sure that a lot of our listeners will as well. So thank you so much. Thank you for listening to the Skeptical Auditor podcast. And a big thank you to our guest, Kathleen Crawford. If you're looking for more ways to stay ahead of the curve and earn CPEs, check out Audit Pro TV On Demand, subscription learning for auditors by auditors. Visit acilearning.com/auditprotv.